Thank you, Mark. I'll try that one today. Julia over here said, because I'm an old professor, losing 20 minutes shouldn't make any difference. I'll just have to speak a little faster than I normally would. So welcome and thanks for coming out. I want to start with referencing a lady called Mary Ann Glendon. I think some of you may know the name. And she wrote a book in 1991 called Rights Talk. And in that book, she says, conversations about vital public matters have nearly come to a halt. This is the book, and I'd recommend it. It's now 30 years old or more, but it does make some of the salient points that I want to address today. But we have seemed to gone even further down the rabbit hole into this realm of woke, and it reminds me of Orwell's line about the smelly little orthodoxies which are now contending for our souls. It's hard to beat George Orwell, isn't it? The smelly little orthodoxies. Anyway, one of the things I want to talk about today is this notion of the erosion of our public discourse, and of course the discourse in our universities. And it seems, as Joanna demonstrated so capably last night, that we are caught up in a world of censorship, of self-censorship. Mark writes very capably about the self-censorship that we in the university community feel, and basically the erosion of educational norms, which were, 5 minutes ago, it seemed to be things that none of us would question. The idea that, for example, the point of a university ought to be to educate young people. Now, we can have endless debates about what that means, but what it does not mean is indoctrinating them or training them. I think it was very revelatory last night when Joanna spoke about diversity and inclusivity training. Doesn't a lot hang on that word? We don't talk about inclusivity and diversity education, for heaven's sakes. That would make people open up their minds and start questioning things. You don't want that. And so, I used to say this to my class, it's the distinction, if you think about it, between, say, sex education and sex training. They bring up two very different kinds of images, don't they? Yes. And so education is, I think, at the center of our mission in the university. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, it means a great deal, and I will have to be brief about this because, of course, we have to get on to other things. Universities should be devoted to the pursuit of truth via critical inquiry. Conversations and discussions are at the core of the educational mission, and Aristotle says, in matters of great importance, we need more than one mind, as the Bible says, come now, let us reason together. Dialogue, then, is the means par excellence to expand our knowledge. Learn to respect different viewpoints. That's something we seem to have lost. And develop our own perspectives. This is why free speech is so very important. It is only by the trying on of ideas that we're able to arrive at our own understandings. Very simply, we should promote anything that encourages constructive discourse while avoiding anything that hinders it. The theme today I want to talk about is how rights talk does get in the way of what I've very simply called constructive discourse. By the way, those of you who haven't read Mark's book about dangerous universities, he's very good on this particular point, and I've cribbed a couple of ideas from Mark over the years. But the point is that we need this dialogue, what the Greeks call the dialectic, to keep the conversation going in the university. But rather than prioritizing the pursuit of knowledge through open debate, reasoned and unbiased inquiry, universities have shifted to a focus on social justice, DEI, and the censorship of wrong think, which apparently gets redefined almost by the hour. One of us, well, we never quite know what it is we are saying that is going to get us in the stir. It leads to a suffocating environment. And as Joanna spoke to last night in the case of Kathleen Stock, it leads to a vile and revolting witch hunt. She asked the question, and it's a question I've had endlessly, where are the adults in the room? Where are those administrators who you would expect to stand up? You know, and this isn't anything new. I remember reading a paper by John Searle, and he was talking about the free speech riots on the Berkeley campus back in the 60s. And he posed that same question. Where were the adults? Where were the administrators in all of this? I think we all know that there's not a lot of courage in senior administration, but I don't think that really gets to it. There's something else going on, and I wish I knew what it was. Why is it that people who know better don't stand up for what is clearly the right thing to do? I haven't had much to do with administration, but I've had a little bit in universities. And yes, there's a lot of gray areas for any administrator in a university, but not everything is gray. There are, from time to time, some black and white issues. And Kathleen Stock may be a good example of just this. Why were those students allowed to do those things to her? That doesn't seem to me to take a great deal of intellectual nous to figure you ought not to do that on a university campus. But nothing was done. The last 30 years or so have brought about a sea change in how Western societies conceive of liberalism. Basically, we've moved from a time of utilitarian liberal theory to a Kantian rights-based liberalism, so that justice, which is at the center, of course, of all political philosophy, justice, broadly understood, has become the pledge of political authority to guarantee the rights of the individual rather than promote some form of the aggregate good. So human rights have come to dominate our political thinking. This is hardly news, I think, to any of us here, but I think what we have failed to do, perhaps, is attend carefully enough on what that means. What does it mean to live in a rights-saturated culture? Before I move on, because a lot of what I'm going to say today is critical of human rights, I think it's more accurate to say I'm critical of what Nigel Bigger calls rights fundamentalism. I want to make it clear that the core and foundation of human rights, that is to say the value and inherent worth and dignity of every individual, seems to be unassailable. By the way, I left my Nigel Bigger book on the WestJet flight, but I would recommend it highly. It's called What's Wrong with Rights. Nigel Bigger, for those of you who may know, is in the news these days for his book about colonialism. This book was his previous title. Bigger is an Oxford Christian ethicist, and a very compelling writer and a very interesting thinker. And I've contacted WestJet this morning in the hopes that they will return my Bigger book. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights preamble states, recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Who can disagree? To put the matter briefly, it's not the ends which human rights seek to bring about, but rather the means of achieving such ends. So it's very tricky when one starts talking about rights because, well, we simply lack another vocabulary, and it's easy to be accused of all sorts of nefarious ideas when you start challenging the dominance of rights talk. What is worrying is a certain kind of irresponsible way of speaking about rights, a manner of speech, a rhetorical turn, if you will, that has become ubiquitous in Canada since the advent of the Charter in 1982, and increasingly throughout the world. And I guess this is really the takeaway here. I've become increasingly uncomfortable with how practically every debate of public morality is now framed exclusively in the language of rights. Perhaps I'm not attending carefully enough to some of the debates in our nation, but I haven't heard people talk about, well, we ought to tolerate these people, we ought to forgive these people. Those words just have escaped our political language, at least to my ear. But again, I hope I might be wrong about that. So my focus is on the rhetoric and limitations of rights talk rather than their philosophical status. But I want to acknowledge at least a few things about rights, and that is that they are most at home in liberal democracies, And they frame complex and nuanced moral issues in a monolithic voice. Again, it's about the idea that there are nuances to most debates, in public debates, of course. They promote certain conditions for human flourishing while discouraging others. Alternative paradigms or framings which might offer a better, more accurate, more useful, more nuanced rendering of the world are precluded from our purview. Glendon remarks, just as rights exist for us only through being articulated, other goods are not even available to be considered if they can be brought to expression only with great difficulty or not at all. So they paint a picture, rights do paint a picture, a myth, if you will, of how we are to approach moral and political questions. In summary, it appears that we don't have any other means of discussing matters of public ethics. And this belief strongly influences our perspective, limiting our ability to perceive experiences differently and preventing us from considering alternative modes of comprehension. Michael Ignatieff, some years ago, wrote this in a little book called The Needs of Strangers. And I think it summarizes much of my disquiet with rights. We forget about the range of needs which cannot be specified as rights and let them slip out of the language of politics. Rights language offers a rich vernacular for the claims an individual may make on or against the collectivity, but it is a relatively impoverished as a means of expressing an individual's need for the collectivity. We are more than rights-bearing creatures, and there is more to respect to a person than his rights. Indeed, yes, there's much more to respect about all of us than the simple fact that we are these rights-bearing creatures, in Ignatieff's language. So in our political discussions, as I just mentioned, we seem to have overlooked the significance of certain desirable qualities and values that cannot be adequately conveyed solely through the lens of individual rights. Our discourse appears to lack the ability to address virtues such as loyalty, friendship, humility, honor, modesty, trustworthiness, compassion, forgiveness, love, charity. These ideals reflect an individual's aspiration to belong to a larger community. And those of you who may have read my book will recognize the communitarian strand in this kind of thinking. I think there is a lot to be said for these kinds of virtues, all of which I seem not to get any purchase in our political conversation. We've allowed them to slip out of our political language, but they are also essential for the types of discussions and conversations that I think ideally should occur within a university environment. And I want to just look at those again and think of these kinds of virtues, not in the context of politics, but in the context of a classroom. In a classroom when we're talking to one another. Loyalty, friendship. Friendship, there is, all the time in a classroom there should be a sense of incipient friendship with one's students. Humility, of course, we're all of us learners. Honor, modesty, trustworthiness, compassion, forgiveness, love, charity. All of these are the kinds of virtues, or so I would say, ought to be endemic in the classroom, at least in some capacity. I guess I belong to a long list of rights skeptics, and you'll probably be familiar with most of these names, if not all of them. Edmund Burke, Jeremy Bentham, Karl Marx, David Ritchie are all individuals who had principled objections to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, or the Rights of Man and the Citizen, as it was called. Burke famously said that rights are too abstract. And when we have these abstract rights, they imply an absoluteness. There is something absolute about them. Bentham, of course, famously called rights nonsense on stilts, by which he meant that unless rights were tied to the common good, to an ideal of the good in society, they were simply nonsensical. Marx and David Ritchie both said that rights fail to account for human society. They leave us isolated as little atoms drifting about. So I have always read Burke sympathetically as well as Bentham, and I've read these people and basically found their arguments compelling. 4 key features of rights talk that highlight some of the complex issues that have led to a decline in our society's ability to have constructive conversations. Anyway, here's some of the things that I find problematic. The Protean nature of rights. Firstly, like some hyperactive philosopher's stones, rights talk has the capacity to transmute every human craving into a species of a moral claim. And notice how effortlessly the grammar of rights lends itself to this metamorphosis. Simply by asserting, I have the right to, or you have the right, or they have the right, it's possible to couch any human aspiration in language which bewitches us into thinking we are dealing with a genuine moral claim. For example, and you can doubtless find examples everywhere, but one of them that comes to mind, a bank advertises its services by proclaiming, you have the right to own your own home. You have the right to own your home. The makers of a beauty soap assure their customers you have the right to self-esteem. And so magically, these common concerns and desires, no matter how mundane or self-interested, become grave matters of principle and morality. The absolutism that was mentioned by Bentham, and the legalism inherent in rights. And the fourth one I want to address is the individualism. So let's move on. I want to talk about the absolutism that was first referenced by Burke. From the outset, it's been acknowledged that rights possess an inflexible and an unwavering quality. In contemporary political discourse, they are deemed, that is, rights are deemed to be universal, inherent, and inviolable. And so Burke was the pioneer in discerning their abstract and consequently inflexible nature. Nevertheless, recent calls for rights have been expressed in fervent and emotive language, which is more akin to religious oration than reasoned discussion. And I think, listen, the next time somebody wants to assert their rights, there's a tone to that assertion, which I think is very like a religious oration rather than a reasoned kind of debate. So magically, all these common concerns and desires, no matter how mundane, become grave matters. But we do pay a price for such linguistic incontinence. When we couch our claims in the categorical language of rights, we are seduced into thinking, and so naturally want others to think, that such claims are, like mathematical proofs, beyond question. And again, this is why rights are so frequently asserted with a sort of puritanical moralizing, which is a register of speech corrosive of civil discourse. And I think it's a register of speech that's corrosive of the educational mission as well. You can't just go around pounding the table, demanding your rights at every turn. But I must say, we're all of us, none of us is immune to this. I mean, the other day I forget what I was doing, but I thought to myself, I have the right to. And I thought for a moment, no, I don't. That's not the right. But it is such a common, sort of pervasive grammatical inflection. There's a risk of this developing a sense of entitlement. So the use of rights applied broadly leads to confusion between legitimate moral rights and non-moral demands, which results in an ever-expanding list of entitlements where any concession from the government is perceived as an irrevocable right. And clearly, governments have finite resources. And if you have the right, there's a corresponding obligation from the government to respect that right. We can't do everything. Governments have to, in some sense, sort of set limits to what can be done. The absolutism of human rights, and these writers, Fuentes, Julio, and Paula Drummond, Right. A human rights thinking and practice essentially perceive the world in binary terms of right or wrong, black and white. In contrast, conflict resolution recognizes ambiguity and capitalizes on areas of gray existing in reality. Engaging with such gray areas risks creating a slippery slope of morality that is troublesome within a human rights frame. Yes, indeed. I mean, so much in our life, so much that presents itself to us on a daily basis is not a black and white matter, but it involves shades of gray. My point is that rights talk doesn't leave conceptual space, if you will, for those shades of gray. And there's a legalistic nature of rights talk. And I want to read this from John Gray, John Gray is the British philosopher. He writes, "If there is a single characteristic that typifies liberal political philosophy in the US over the past quarter of a century, it is its domination by a jurisprudential paradigm. The model of reasoning presupposed in this turn to legalism in recent American theory is the judicial interpretation of constitutional rights rather than the formulation of public policy in public discourse." I think that's very well said, and it's my emphasis, but that seems to be the case in this country as well, is it not? Political decisions, which in my view ought to be talked about in Parliament, figured out by our elected representatives, have been punted, some might say, to the courts. And again, last night Joanna used the term bypassing democracy. Yes, indeed. Nobody elected these judges. They are 9 lawyers who put on black robes and then determine what the rest of us ought to do or ought to think. I'm kind of an old-fashioned believer in parliamentary debate. I think that's where these issues ought to be debated. A controversial issue from a few years back, Carter v. the Crown, we now have in this country the right to physician-assisted death, right? I don't have a view on that particularly. My only view is that I don't think that ought to have been decided by judges. I think that should have been a parliamentary debate with our elected representatives. Rights are individualistic. I mean, it's a logical truth that any moral code that prioritizes individual rights will inevitably result in an individualistic society that, erodes the concept of community. In a rights-centric moral code, the sense of responsibility towards our loved ones, our community, our nation, or even ourselves is greatly diminished. As pointed out by Glendon, this is a consequence of emphasizing individual rights in morality. And again, I quote her, "Rights in our standard formulation tend to be presented as absolute, individual, and independent of any necessary relation to responsibilities." There is, of course, a much older tradition of human rights in Catholic thought where rights would be are tied, I should say, to family and to community. And so the Catholic tradition of human rights philosophy has rights intimately linked to the broader community in a way that simply is not true of the kind of rights in a liberal democracy today. In order to restore the values of universities, I think we need to move beyond the limitations of rights-based language and develop a more selfless, tolerant, charitable, and imaginative perspective, one that can account for many of these older virtues. Although the exact shape of the new ethical framework is uncertain, it must be a language that promotes collegiality, tolerance, and a more subtle and nuanced approach to complex issues. One that eschews a world of black and white and understands that, for most of us, the world presents in shades of gray. Above all, this language must be able to avoid the numerous hazards and risks that come with the use of rights talk. I guess like a lot of you here, I've been kind of staggered by what has happened to our universities over the past 10, 20 years, whatever it is. And I don't have a quick answer as to what's happened. There's been many things happening, clearly. But I think one of the crucial issues has been this move into a Kantian, John Rawlsian, if you will, based understanding of human rights that has eroded our sense of community and has kept us all in our separate little silos. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Please. Oh, Francis.
Thank you very much for your talk. One thing that came to my mind listening to your discussion about these issues is rights, and this is something that I have experienced in dealing with these conflicts within a rights kind of framework, is rights tend to result in procedures being prized over substance.
Yes, indeed.
The actual principles and the philosophical characteristics. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this kind of procedural kind of...
Well, you're absolutely right. The rights talk of, say, since John Rawls, 1970, A Theory of Justice, has been procedural. You're absolutely right. And in an earlier draft, I did talk about that a little bit, but for reasons of time, I didn't. And it goes back to what Bentham talked about, the severing of the right from the good. So we don't have substantive understandings of the good, but we have any number of procedural understandings. You know, Rawls' great theme was justice as fairness, right? And so in his understanding, that results in some kind of proceduralism. But you're quite right. And by the way, Francis, the Glendon book is very good on that proceduralism inherent in the rights talk. So thank you for the question. Yes.
David. Thank you. I think I agree with you. So I would start with that, but I want to just clarify, because you seem to be mapping out the difference between the classical liberal or the libertarian position, which is very rights-based, very rational, versus the conservative position. So this is what I'm seeing first of all. Now the conservative position proposes things like the individual is inextricably linked to the community. It also insists upon things like honor, modesty, especially within the Judeo-Christian tradition of conservatism. So I look at that and I want to know, are you arguing for the conservative position to supplant or replace the classical liberal position, which does seem to be dominant in both our conversations and in our society?
Good question. I'll step back a moment and say that I think instead of juxtaposing, as it were, the conservative and the liberal tradition, I prefer to juxtapose the liberal tradition with an older virtue-based Aristotelian kind of ethic, which I guess some people might call that conservative. But I think the crucial missing element in liberal thought, if you will, is, again, the concept of the good, right? And until we can get back to articulating, debating, talking about the good, as opposed to simply procedural fairness, then I guess I don't really mind if we want to call that conservative or liberalism. And there is, in the liberal tradition as well, there's a pretty... a strong strain that strives for the good as well. But they lost the battle, is how I would see it, you know. But thank you. And they didn't bring any cake either yesterday, by the way. So you got the last piece. Anyway.
Just the last rejoinder to that, and then you still keep sounding like you're arguing for the conservative position. Just because if you're arguing for the good, you're almost talking a historical empiricism that says the good is this, because over time we've decided whether it's Aristotle or Moses or Jesus. You sound like you're arguing.
You know, I guess so. Yeah, I call myself a conservative in certain venues, and I'm certainly more sympathetic to the conservative cause in many instances. Yes, it depends on what you mean by conservatism. Isn't that the okay? So
I really appreciated how you made the link between kind of the individualism, which is interesting. But how would you, in terms of rights, how would you link that in terms of talent and meritocracy? Doesn't that, like the discourse that we have, for example, I'm talking about. Recently, there's a petition online to grant, for example, a seat and a half to larger people on planes, for example. And so that's the right. And there are many examples of this. But how would meritocracy and the idea of talent? Don't you think that kind of the rights talk kind of limits meritocracy and undermines the society, you know, of meritocracy and talent? And does that allow it to flourish? It's just that what role do you think that the idea of meritocratic society and talent plays and can interact with the idea of the rights stack as we see in the DEI context? Does that make sense?
Yeah. You flummoxed me. I really can't respond. Can we talk after? I'd like to. Yeah, I don't have a coherent answer for you. I'm sorry.
Bill, and then Boris, and Andrew, and then Amir. Oh, and Ava. Okay.
Thanks very much for a thought-expanding talk. Within the language and discourse that's based on rights, reflecting on 2 points. First, although people like to talk a great deal about rights, they don't like to priorize or create a rights hierarchy. Back in the 1980s, I was editing a journal, and a submission involved administering testosterone to people living with AIDS in order to respect their right to libido, to strengthen their libido. And the counterpoint was, okay, let's talk about rights, and is there a superordinate right for people to stay alive? And there was no tolerance for discussion of order and rights. In all of our lives with research ethics boards are committed to rights, and they are absolutely silent when rights conflict. So I, as an indigenous person, don't have the right to agree to participate in research unless my indigenous band leader gives permission. So what do you do when rights conflict? So there's an intrinsic real problem with hierarchy and conflict within rights discourse. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this is why somebody like, for example, Alistair McIntyre says we're just stuck in an endless loop of emotivism. So I emote my rights versus you emoting your rights, and that there is no rational discourse. There is no rational ordering of hierarchies, if you will. The right to administer testosterone versus the right, you know, these debates become endless. They become frustrating too. Did you sit on a research ethics board, did you say?
I've had the experience.
Yeah, me too. It is an experience, isn't it? You know, it's quite extraordinary how these rights clash.
Yeah. Well, the response to, I entertained ethics responses to, I published this article and called for ethics discussion. And I said, superordinate right is keeping people alive. And many people were so unthinkingly committed to ameliorating the suffering of the individual as a right that they couldn't live with a prioritization of rights.
Yeah, it's curious. It goes back to, what was your slide last night, Joanna? Sorry, about the greater good has to be sacrificed for this, but what happens, it seems to me, is that you just have somebody who's more rhetorically capable and fast on their feet than the next person. But there isn't, I can't really see a rational way of resolving those issues.
Well, I think they need to be discussed and they're avoided at all costs.
Boris, Andrew, Amir, and Ava, and then we'll see if we can get Gloria.
Thanks. You raised so many good questions, all the very important issues connected with this rights talk, as you put it. But as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering whether the problem is really intrinsic in rights talk, or do these problems arise when rights talk is divorced from, separated from a coherent, convincing philosophical account of the grounds, you might say ontological grounds of rights. You raised one possibility when you spoke of the Catholic understanding of rights. They tie rights to community, to family, things of that nature. Another example is Hobbes. He ties the notion of rights to, together with the notion of natural law, to a coherent, powerful, not necessarily conclusive, but powerful account of human nature, in which he says there's no such thing as the summum bonum. There's only the summum melon. Regardless of whether it's true or not, the point is it's grounded in an account of human nature, and that account puts restraints on and disciplines talk of human rights. Not everything counts as a right, as he makes abundantly clear. So this seems to me to be part of the problem, which I think you're kind of alluding to. It's been divorced from a philosophical account or religious account of the grounds.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we've divorced rights talk, if you will, from a broader understanding of the human condition. To say it quickly, the positive legal tradition of rights has trumped natural law, right? Something like that. So, yeah, so I think we have to move back to an older understanding of rights connected to community, family. Jacques Maritain was, the Catholic philosopher, was crucial in writing the 1948 Declaration of the Human Rights. And, it's interesting to speculate what he might have made of our current position.
So force ourselves to address the question. Well, okay, you believe these are your rights. On what grounds?
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to just simply, well, it's my right because I want it.
Andrew, so I think the appeal to parliamentary supremacy is a challenging one because, it's the old line about two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner, right? And you have parliamentarians that are licensed to vote away our, if I may use the word rights, whether you're talking about vaccine mandates, whether you're talking about reproductive rights for people who need those, or whatever the right is at issue. And obviously, take to the logical extreme, no one would, I hope, support 99 people deciding to kill the 100th person. We would say that person has a right to live. So does your conception of rights have non-negotiables? Does it have rights that you believe are absolute? Or do you believe that those things will naturally flow from the position on these things that you are advocating?
That is a challenging question. I do think something, and again, I'm going to have to do exactly what Burke and et al. Accused rights people of doing, and that is reverting to abstractions. So I would say something like, I'm not negotiable about the inherent dignity of each and every individual. And again, we can have a conversation about what that means in practice, but I'm not willing to, as it were, barter away the individual integrity and worth of the individual. But again, insofar as I have, I forget exactly what you said, Andrew, about non-negotiable rights, something like that?
Yeah, the rights that you believe are absolute in black and white. You would say, for example, the sheep has a right to life. A colony run by wolves.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I would just, have to, again, come back to those abstractions, something like the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. And it's very difficult to get away, I think, from, the next question was, well, why ought we to respect each and every individual, right? And I don't think there's a good answer to that, apart from positing some metaphysical speculation about, the ends, the telos of the human condition. But that's a talk for another day.
Amir.
Yes, so thank you very much for the presentation. As I was listening to you, kind of a thought experiment came to my mind, and that is, so if we imagine, and I want to piggyback on the previous question as well, if we imagine, say, a body of people who decide on, through any means or for any reason, that, say, blue-eyed physicians would not be allowed to practice anymore. So how would we, in this framework that you were going through, how would we approach that kind of decision or that kind of issue without having a rights-based framework for governance?
Well, I think, again, I would go back to my previous answer and just appeal to something like the inherent worth and dignity of each and every individual, blue-eyed physician or otherwise. That there's something in the human condition, in the human nature, if you will, that is inviolable. We don't get to just arbitrarily say blue-eyed physicians can't do this or that or the other thing. So again, it appears that I am painting myself in a corner here, but I don't think so. I think that the escape clause, if you will, There was a mixed metaphors in there, okay? But the escape clause has to be some kind of appeal to some ontological reality, something like that.
Ava.
My question is very related to boundaries, and I feel very sympathetic to this outline that you have of rights and the importance of community values and so on. But there's one particular right that this group is, that's why we're here, and that's free speech. And when it comes to free speech, I tend to think this may be the one absolute. I don't really believe that it's the absolute.
In the absoluteness of free
It's close
speech?
to the absoluteness. And that the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, where the hell would we be without it right now? And so with that, how do you see that this particular concern with free speech fits into a communitarian or...
Yeah, good question. I guess I, like you, might be willing to say that free speech is in some iteration some kind of absolutist freedom on which everything else depends. It depends on us being able to talk to one another, as we're doing here today. It depends on teachers being able to talk to their students, and their students being able to talk to their teachers. We sometimes forget that part of the equation, right? You know, and so we want to ensure that freedom of speech. And so, good point. I think yes, maybe free speech is the one absolutist thing that we need.
Stefan, last question. Oh. Good. Okay, so I'm generally sympathetic, very sympathetic to your position. Obviously, I'm not going to start. So the question I have is this: you've complained about the individualism of rights, and I agree. Now, one of the arguments that's often made is that this EI stuff is actually has a collectivist bent to it. Now, I tend to think that it is in fact actually a form of individualism, but there is an obvious tension here, right? Some people will go so far as to say it's Marxist in the way it works. So how would you resolve that tension? How do you approach, this sort of like, it goes back, I think the question was asked earlier, right? We all have an individual right to just start seats, and all of a sudden some person starts saying, I have a right to a seat and a half because I'm larger, right?
Okay.
So unequal standards based on appeals to collective forms or identitarian notions that tie certain groups. So how do you resolve that issue within your group?
Can the three of us talk afterwards? Okay. Yes. It's a very, very good point, but I'm sorry. I really, you came at it very cleverly, but I still don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.